Hi, I'm Hutton Baird, and the title of my paper is From One Blood, Berea College's Sustained Devotion to Equal Education for Black and White Students. Dedicated to abolishing slavery, educating African Americans, promoting Christian values, and nurturing racial equality, the Protestant-based American Missionary Association, hereafter AMA, founded 11 colleges along with hundreds of other schools for African American students in the southern United States. Almost all of them were begun in the wake of the Civil War. One of the AMA's earliest successes, Berea College in Madison County, Kentucky, was founded in 1855. Under the leadership of AMA missionary Reverend John Gregg Fee, the college opened its doors to African American as well as white male and female students in 1865. Reverend Fee was followed by a succession of presidents equally dedicated to maintaining a diverse student body and providing an excellent education. While all faced significant challenges during their administrations, including limited funds and community distrust of their biracial mission, no president faced more opposition than William Frost, in term from 1892 to 1920, during the Jim Crow era, when he had to make the difficult decision to close Berea to black students in 1904. This paper examines the circumstances that led President Frost to make this decision and argues that, despite his apparent abandonment of Berea's commitment to educating African Americans, he remained true to the AMA's original intention. The AMA selected Reverend John Fee to establish Berea College after the Lane Seminary-trained preacher published an essay in the New York Evangelist explaining his desire to found an integrated school. Fee had already established a church in Madison County, Kentucky, so the AMA chose to place the college there as well. In the late antebellum era, Madison County was populated mostly by white farmers producing tobacco and raising livestock. Slaves formed over a third of the population, and despite Kentucky's status as a border state, the bulk of the county's white residents were staunch pro-slavery advocates. Not surprisingly, Reverend Fee received little support from the surrounding communities for his northern-based AMA-sponsored venture. Unlike most of the other AMA colleges, Berea's mission was broad-based thanks to Fee's vision. Not only was Berea intended to educate African American students, but it was also intended to support poor white students from the Appalachian Mountains, a notoriously underserved region even for the South. The AMA was supportive of Fee's efforts as it had already appointed young, theology-trained preachers to teach as well as minister in the Kentucky hills and dales. These ministers were popular not only among poor mountain families, but among the local elite too, prompting the daughters and sons of some slaveholding families to take part in the, quote, joyous atmospheres that the ministers created. Not a few of the students became insensibly enamored with the love of liberty, end quote. These religious men encouraged these white Kentuckian offspring, rich and poor alike, to pursue a formal education at the fledgling Berea College by 1858, but despite the school's original mission, African American students had not yet been recruited. Recruitment was stalled not because of a lack of commitment on Reverend Fee's part. In fact, Fee was passionate about black education and he was a strong abolitionist. But he discovered that the local reception of what they perceived to be his radical set of beliefs thwarted his efforts. In the context of mounting tensions between northern and southern states over slavery, and inflamed by the new fear of slave raids sparked by Harper's Ferry on October 16, 1859, local white residents held a mass meeting at which they agreed that, quote, liberty and slavery could not dwell together, and that in a slave state, men advocating liberty were a dangerous element. Berea College faculty members, known for their abolitionist sensibilities, subsequently received so many violent threats that they left town to protect themselves and their families, forcing Fee to close Berea College in 1859. This setback proved temporary. Faculty and students returned to Berea at the end of the Civil War. William Fairchild was elected the college's first president, and a board of trustees was established, all by the fall of 1865. The school administrators immediately recommitted themselves to biracial education, adopting a new motto for the college from a biblical verse, quote, God has made of one blood all peoples of the earth, end quote. Their dream of biracial education was finally enacted on March 1, 1866, when 3 black students entered Professor Rogers' homeroom class. Unfortunately, as President Fairchild sadly noted, not everyone embraced this biracial plan. He said, the morning those 3 harmless youths walked in, half my school walked out. But because the college had been popular with white families and their children before the Civil War, and because white families lacked alternative colleges nearby after the war, many white students promptly returned, and the spots of those who did not were quickly filled by black students. Berea College was finally operating successfully as an interracial school. In fact, over the next 2 decades, the racial balance of Berea College would increasingly favor black students. The surrounding Kentucky counties were dumbfounded by this development of a biracial college in their midst, and all the more so when they discovered that African American and white students were not simply sharing classroom space together, but their social lives were integrated as well. Perhaps because most of the white students, who were increasingly poor Appalachian whites, had not grown up in slaveholding families, they were more amenable to Fee's biracial education insistence. They also shared the unifying experience of poverty with their black classmates and the opportunities to secure an education through their own hard work and perseverance. Because all students were needy, male and female, black and white, they all participated in the school's labor program to compensate for their tuition, which acted as a great leveler as well. Despite this exceptional biracial educational experience, confusion over whether or not some racial boundaries were needed occurred nonetheless. Berea professors were heavily involved in the lives of their students, and they were wont to pass judgment. Inappropriate interaction with members of the opposite sex incurred their greatest wrath. When relationships across the color line compounded opposite sex intimacy, as it did in 1872, trouble began to brew. A faculty member deemed inappropriate a relationship between a white male student and a black female student, and wider concern among the faculty was raised. The issue was taken up before the Berea College faculty and board of trustees. Should the school uphold its anti-racist sentiment upon which the institution was built and refuse to punish this couple, or should it support a notion of racial purity and therefore prevent interracial dating? The debate lasted the entire school year, but in the end, school authorities decided not only that interracial dating was acceptable, but so was interracial marriage. Virtually every aspect of racial integration at Berea College was now condoned in theory and in practice. As the century was coming to a close, Berea College had defeated the odds by providing interracial education for poor white and African American students for almost 3 decades. In 1890, President Fairchild and the rest of the Berea College Executive Board decided it was time for a new president. They offered the job to William Frost from Oberlin College, the first institution of higher learning in the country to enroll women and African Americans, but they were sorely disappointed when he turned it down. 2 years later, the trustees sought out Frost again, and he accepted. By this time, the student body had become overwhelmingly African American. In 1866, a total of 187 students were enrolled, 96 of them African Americans. 9 years later, in 1875, enrollment had increased by 50, with 143 blacks and 94 whites attending. In 1889, 14 years later, the school's total enrollment had increased to 334, with 177 African American students. Only in 1877 did whites outnumber black, 144 to 129. As the incoming president, Frost immediately committed the school to securing a more racially balanced student body. He felt a special obligation to seek out white students from the Appalachian Mountains, which he pursued through publications and talks. Because he understood that most mountaineer children did not seek out a college education because their labor was so indispensable to their family, Frost also initiated an extension service that brought teachers to remote counties for several days at a time to offer instruction. These efforts proved to be successful. Frost not only brought back enough white students to balance the student body, but by 1900, more students were now white than black. It's important to know, however, that Frost remained committed to a strong black student population and biracial education, irrespective of these new recruitment efforts. However, African American enrollment numbers had been declining at this time in light of harsh new Jim Crow laws. Under Frost's leadership, no Berea student was coerced into adopting a belief in racial equality. If a student did not adopt the tenets of the Berea Constitution, he or she was asked to leave. Frost himself recognized how unusual the situation was and observed that the, quote, mingling of races, end quote, would not work under all conditions at all schools. In order for emancipation to be successful in the long term, he argued, white Americans needed to be personally and spiritually freed from their racial prejudices too. He had seen this change of mind work at Berea. This meant that, for the first time in many of their lives, the African American students saw themselves on a level playing field with white students. Frost observed that, quote, the Negro has had the sobering opportunity to measure himself by the Caucasian, and the white student has been emancipated from the narrowness and bigotry of caste, end quote. In Frost's mind, Berea College allowed students of both races to experience emancipation from the rigidly racist social structure they had grown up in. Although approximately 75,000 African Americans in Kentucky had been freed from slavery in 1865 and had secured civil and political rights through the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, the Kentucky state legislature had passed law after law beginning in 1865 to prohibit these African American freedoms. That year, the legislature voted to prohibit whites from marrying African Americans, and the next year, the legislature voted to give school districts the right to create separate schools across race. In 1873, the legislature made it unlawful for a black child to attend a white school, and vice versa, and separate colored schools had to keep at least a mile away from separate white schools. Then, in 1893, Kentucky passed even more miscegenation laws. Clearly, hostility towards African American freedoms had been mounting over the post-war period and into the new century. No wonder that the number of students, both white and black, had been rising and then declining over the course of Berea's history. In 1904, State Representative Carl Day introduced a bill in the Kentucky legislative session to prohibit white and colored students from attending the same private institutions of higher education. In fact, Day was aiming this law directly at Berea College since it was the only interracial school of higher education in the state. Most white Kentuckians were pleased by this measure. They had been opposed to Berea's mission and had been waiting for this moment. A heartbroken President Frost knew the bill would pass. His politician friends reminded him that 1904 was an election year and they could not vote with their heart. As one historian of the college noted, quote, "They admitted to Frost that if the bill ever came to a vote, they would have to support it on pain of everlasting retirement from politics," end quote. Even so, the Board of Trustees at Berea fought the bill, arguing that the state could not control the action of a private institution. When informed by the House Committee on Education that the Day bill would pass, Frost traveled to Frankfurt and berated the legislators, claiming that the, quote, "academic freedom of the college was being violated," end quote. Despite Frost's pleas, the legislators were unbending and the bill passed as expected on March 22nd. Irregardless of the new law, Berea College continued to educate white and black students together. Aware of this situation, the government began imposing fines on the collective school as well as individuals. In 1908, as a last-ditch effort to repeal the law and revoke the fines, Frost and the rest of the board fought the Day law all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Much to Frost's disappointment, the Supreme Court upheld the legality of the law and required that Berea separate its white and black students. Frost, described by his colleagues at Berea as a shrewd man, had anticipated this outcome and had begun seeking alternatives years before. After the Day law passed in 1904, Frost had concluded that Berea should extend its charter to include a separate school for African American students. With the consent and encouragement of the Board of Trustees, Frost made the executive decision to divide funds between Berea and the new institution. As if the state legislators had not attacked Berea College enough, lawyers advised Frost in the midst of his process that it would be illegal to give Berea's funds to another institution despite an extended charter. Now, Frost had to find a way to raise funds independently. In the interim, the Board of Trustees helped their African American students with financial aid and admission to other African American colleges in the South, such as Fisk, Hampton, Knoxville, and Wilberforce. Frost's decision to relocate the African American rather than the white students was based on efficiency. He believed that, since the African Americans constituted the smaller student body population at the time, they would be easier to transfer. As they left Berea College, the white students who remained felt a void. They sorely missed their African American colleagues and vocalized their feelings in a compilation of resolutions passed in September of 1904. Along with stating that they, quote, "looked forward to hearing about their friends' successes and abhorred injustices based solely on race," end quote, the white students, quote, closed their letter saying, "We shall cheerfully give up part of our advantage, if necessary, in order that the colored people may have their just share." Their purpose was to ensure their African American peers that Berea College would help them as much as possible, even if that meant cutting into their own resources. And it was also a statement about their convictions to the broader white society. Clearly, the White Mountain students who had lived with these African American students had built a campus based on trust and friendship and had established relationships across the color line that most of the students, white and black alike, had never experienced before. It was under these auspices that Berea College leaders determined it was time for the new African American college to be constructed. Determining the name of the school and where it would be built proved to be more difficult than anticipated. Realizing that no school in Kentucky was named after President Abraham Lincoln, although it was his native state, the Board of Trustees decided to dedicate their new institution to him. As the father of the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln had freed African Americans from slavery and helped secure them the rights to full citizenship, at least under the law, thus embodying the goals the AMA wished to achieve through Berea. The official founding of the new school occurred on Lincoln's 100th birthday anniversary, February 12, 1909. Frost and the board discovered that racist Kentuckians were resistant to having a school for colored students open in their town, especially one named after the president who inaugurated a war and passed the amendment that lost them their means of economic success. The first town in which Berea trustees tried to place their Lincoln Institute was in Anchorage, Kentucky. However, hostility from whites was so strong that they were forced to reconsider. They next attempted to site the institute in Simpsonville, Kentucky, near the heart of the biggest African-American population in the state. Adamantly fighting for their right to stay on the land despite heavy protests from whites, Berea trustees were finally able to give Lincoln Institute a permanent home there on January 17, 1910. They then began to make decisions on important educational matters such as curriculum and faculty. Frost set out to make Lincoln Institute Berea College's equal from the start. The curriculum at Lincoln Institute was to be the same as that at Berea, normal training for 4 to 6 years after the 8th grade. Unlike Berea College, however, Lincoln offered humanities as well as maintenance engineering courses. Recognizing that after graduation, many of the Lincoln male students would most likely be hired into this industrial workforce, regardless of their economic success, Lincoln Institute leaders wanted to dignify this type of work and ensure that their African American students would have been overqualified for any job. Most white Southerners embraced a demeaning mindset about African Americans and had put their capabilities in a restricted box. They appreciated Booker T. Washington's more passive views about African American education. A key proponent that blacks should focus on labor-based training, Washington was, quote, constantly called upon to evaluate the industrial education curriculum of schools, end quote. Despite this sad truth, the courses offered and lessons taught at Lincoln Institute ensured the betterment of African American students and assessed their progress based on their success in the classroom. Many of the original teachers at Lincoln Institute were graduates of Berea College's Normal Department, a program specifically designed to train teachers to teach in Kentucky and had the African American student best interest at heart. President Frost himself served on Lincoln Institute's Board of Trustees to ensure that equality was weaved into every aspect of the school. The training received at Lincoln Institute was exceptional, lessons were comprehended, and Christian morals were adopted and followed daily. The shared emphasis on Christianity bonded Lincoln Institute and Berea College perhaps above all else. Berea College was founded on and upheld for decades the Christian principle that all people were equal in the eyes of the Lord and thus should be treated equally by all men on earth. Lincoln Institute founders held the same beliefs and decided that their school would be a Christian one, requiring weekly religious events such as Sunday school and prayer meetings. The original purpose of the AMA was being fulfilled in a new way through Lincoln Institute. Most of the ideals and lessons intended for whites to bestow upon African Americans were now being implemented by African Americans themselves at their own institution. Educating African Americans, promoting Christian ideals, and promoting racial equality were the key purposes of the AMA, and Lincoln Institute became the physical representation of these purposes lived out. Historians today maintain a distinct skepticism about the establishment of Lincoln Institute. Many critics, both modern and in the early 20th century, claimed that Frost had acted out of a racist paternalism in creating a separate school for black students. A 1904 rumor even suggested that President Frost had been one of the voices behind the state legislation to segregate the races. Frost passionately denied this. He knew that Berea College was a city on a hill, offering an exceptional biracial education. Frost had proved his devotion to this cause by fighting the day law as far as he legally could, and then by building a school to equally serve the black students in Kentucky. The hard reality was that he had to adopt some paternalistic actions so that the African American students would not lose their opportunity altogether in the context of mounting Jim Crow era tensions. If Frost had actually believed in the racial superiority of whites, he would not have founded Lincoln Institute. Opening a school for African Americans in Kentucky caused a lot of anger among white Kentuckians, but Frost had figured out how to dilute some of that anger by offering a socially acceptable industrial education. Frost and the Board of Trustees were maintaining a delicate balance between their goals and their critics in order to keep Lincoln Institute alive, even if they had to forego their dream of a biracial education at Berea. The challenges were so great that Frost suffered a mental breakdown while on his last journey to raise funds for both colleges in 1916. Frost recognized that he could only give a few more years to this school, and in fact, the trustees of the college asked for his resignation in 1920. William Hutchins, also a former Oberlin student and promoter of equality, became the new president. Berea College and Lincoln Institute continued to grow and operate in parallel until 1950, when the overturning of the state legislation finally made it legal for them to combine. In 1947, a group of students known as the Young People's Socialist League for Berea contacted the NAACP to get help to overthrow the day law. It took 3 years of hard work before the Kentucky legislature voted to, quote, allow colleges on both undergraduate and graduate levels to desegregate at their own choosing, end quote. Celebrating this long-awaited victory, Berea College's Board of Trustees instantly reaffirmed its commitment to white mountaineers and African-American students alike. When the doors opened that next fall, 2 black students walked in, a young man and a young woman. The first African-American man to re-enter wrote to the school newspaper, quote, I have been treated as an equal. This year has truly been 2 semesters of democracy in practice rather than just in name, end quote. Through his words, the founding mission of Berea College, implemented by the AMA a century prior, had finally been completed.